think this is on. Can you all hear me? Yeah? Thank you so much for that, Doug. I'm going to make you follow me around to my in-laws' Thanksgiving, I think, this year, just to say that for them. I want to thank Doug and Shelby, who I think was my initial inviter, for picking me up at the airport yesterday, and Deborah for showing me such a great time today. Doug mentioned, I grew up in and did my BLA at the University of Arkansas. And so Penn and Philly often feel like very foreign places to me. This feels much more like home. And so I want to thank you for making me feel at home the last day and a half or so, and for inviting me here to talk about this. So I'm gonna try and go quick because there's a lot here, and I could literally talk about this forever. And I'm in the middle of a seminar on this topic with some grad students at Penn now, which is like 16 lectures like this that are all 3 hours long. So I could talk for the next 48 hours about this if you really wanted to stay here. But I'm going to be quick. And I'm going to talk about three things really quickly. One is, I think, a piece of sort of theoretical or critical work that was the sort of genesis of this invitation, and maybe the genesis of some of the other work you'll see. Another is some of the work that we're doing now in the McHarg Center that is directly tied to sort of political and policy development cycles. So as Doug sort of, I think, intimated, HR 5185, I think, is the number. This is the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act introduced by AOC and Bernie in the fall. Is a bill that Bernie likes to, in his gruff voice at campaign rallies, sort of say like, I wrote the damn bill. But we actually wrote that one for him, along with a bunch of other things to support it. So I'm going to talk about sort of how and why that came together, and sort of how and why the Green New Deal is sort of in front of us now at this moment. And then I'm going to talk about, really quickly, some of the stuff we've been doing outside of that cycle, also tied to climate and the Green New Deal. The Atlas Project, Doug sort of really quickly mentioned, is part of that, so I'll skim through that quickly. We just finished an interdisciplinary studio within the center with architects, landscape architects, and city planners, sort of asking questions about what and where and how the rollout of the Green New Deal might look like, where it might go first for all kinds of reasons, including Iowa and the Midwest in that studio. So we'll talk about some of that stuff. I'm always really nervous about showing people pictures of places they live that I don't, but we're going to do that, and you can throw things at me if you want to. But I think this was probably the genesis of the invitation from Shelby and from others. A piece that I wrote for Places Journal really a couple years ago, but that got published last April, called Designing the Green New Deal, that among other things I think is putting forward an argument that is not new to anyone outside of landscape architecture, and it isn't actually even that new inside of landscape architecture, but that for whatever reason I think caught particular attention at the moment this was published, which is just that design is itself not an agent of change, but that it is an instrument of power. And how power has been structured over time and over history has structured what's possible or not within the design professions. And began with a very tepid line. I don't know when the myth of landscape architects as climate saviors began, but I know it's time to kill it, which, as you can imagine, got me invited to all kinds of dinner parties and things. But it was in there in part because, let me pick up my notes here, because some of this is a little bit new, so I'm going to make sure I get this right. Part of that is because there has been a turn within the business development and other offices within the business development wing of landscape and architecture and city planning and urban design firms to sort of think of themselves and market themselves as sort of agents of sort of fighting climate change. So building a project like Abu Dhabi's National Oil Company headquarters in the most low carbon way, as a way through HOK, thinking about that as a way of thinking that you're intervening in the global climate system. And that thinking about, say, AECOM's reach across the globe, which AECOM does lots of sort of amazing projects in other places. It also is 100% a sort of machine chasing global capital all over the world, building terrible things for terrible people for terrible reasons, in the same way that HOK is. We can think about someone like Bjarke Ingels, who I think some people were surprised to see taking a trip to Brazil to hang out with Jair Bolsonaro a few weeks ago, and then defending it very ardently in this essay and then in a lecture he just gave at Columbia a few weeks ago. And I think if you imagine these firms, again, as sort of perfectly designed sort of capital accumulation machines, which is what they are chasing global capital all over the world and expressing it in physical form in places where it is allowing them to operate. It is not a surprise that Bjarke, like generations of architects before him, would see an opportunity to work for an eco-fascist who's also committing murder in his country and dispossessing indigenous people of their land in Brazil. He also, in this lecture, described this sort of position within architecture as occupying the radical middle. which I think, again, we should be prepared for those kinds of arguments to undercut the idea that what we do in our design projects is itself sort of apolitical, or is, I think, in the best case scenario for design firms making this argument that they're attenuating the worst impacts of capitalism. And that in Björke's case, he's actually just quite happy to conspire with whoever will pay him to conspire with them. And even for Martha Schwartz, who I really admire for the way she has turned landscape architecture towards climate change, even though much of her practice has nothing to do with climate change. And this is an image chosen by MSP to put on their site of a project that is in Abu Dhabi, one of the highest carbon projects you could possibly imagine. It's showing, essentially, it's pictorializing for us the sort of incredible class divide you would expect to find in one of the richest global petrol states in the world. And actually, I think Rachel McAdams is photoshopped in here somewhere. She's sitting in the front bubble here, staring off into the distance. But they're sort of reproducing for us an image you would expect to find in this kind of a city of global capital, while going to conferences and writing books and giving other kinds of talks about the way in which their work is addressing climate change directly. And I don't think we should be particularly surprised by this, in part because the groundwork for this kind of intervention or this kind of operation of design was laid 20, 25, 30 years ago in architecture and landscape architecture by this move towards sort of post-criticism, right? So that the operation of design fields, architecture, landscape architecture, city planning, urban design, are beyond criticism. And there are good reasons why this turn in architecture and landscape architecture began at the time. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want, but nevertheless, essays like this, the response to it a few years later in 2004, which is tracing the provenance of some of this back to Rem Koolhaas, who has a very insane show right now at the Guggenheim about the countryside. He has discovered that landscape is a thing that exists in the world. Doesn't know what people do there. The sort of promotional quote that's been used by him, chosen by him for that show, is that half the world lives in the countryside and no one knows what they're doing there, which I think anyone who's ever asked that question or thought about it for more than 3 seconds, which I think is about how long he thought about the content of that show, would know what people are doing in the countryside. But nevertheless, they trace this sort of post-critical moment back to Rem, back to the Doppler effect essay we just looked at from Sarah Whiting and Hayes. And then within landscape architecture, back to Jim Corner himself, who I think, again, many people look at the sort of state of field operations as a practice and sort of wonder how it could be that one of the most critical voices in landscape architecture is now running what's essentially a luxury real estate development firm. They're doing incredible work. I don't mean to say that it's not beautiful or compelling, but it nevertheless, the groundwork for its operations have been laid by this idea that the operation of design is beyond criticism, and its chosen collaborators, conspirators, do not matter. And we'll skip through this second one from Jim. And I say that because, we often think about design as this sort of special, Doug was sort of, I think, hinting at this sort of special category of sort of lone creative geniuses or people who are working in special ways that others cannot. And I think maybe in some ways that's true, but I actually think of design firms, especially global design firms like AECOM, HOK, MSP, and others, as far more akin to, say, McKinsey, right? Which is itself a global consulting management consulting firm chasing these same streams of capital in these same places, operating in the same way. Theirs is simply tailored to organizational management instead of management of the built environment. And the question that I put forward in this essay for Places, right, is that can a set of practices tied to luxury real estate deliver anything meaningful to communities impacted by global warming and inequality? Or put another way, can we all here, the instruments of neoliberalism and active forces in the fight for climate justice? And I think the answer to that is pretty obviously no, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. And I'm going to play this video really quickly if my Wi-Fi cooperates, in part because, has anybody seen this video? Do you know what I'm about to play? No hands? You've all been like saturated with this shit for a very long time. So this is an ad from Joe Biden attacking Pete Buttigieg, I think ahead of Nevada, in which he's trying to contrast his experience with Mayor Pete's and saying that basically like the work Mayor Pete has done has not mattered because he's like repaving sidewalks, he's doing effectively urban design work. And Joe Biden, I think, is in many ways putting landscape architecture into the presidential primary conversation for the first time in a very long time in a way that is completely derogatory and also, I think, a reasonable explanation of what we actually do. So let me see if I can just play. It's quite terrifying for practitioners. you know how this works, Marie? Oh wait, you did.
Called on Pete Buttigieg, he installed decorative lights under
We'll just let it play from there. You get it.
South Bend colorfully illuminated rivers. Both Vice President Biden and former Mayor Buttigieg have taken on tough fights. Under threat of a nuclear Iran, Joe Biden helped to negotiate the Iran deal. And under threat of disappearing pets, Buttigieg negotiated lighter licensing regulations on pet chip scanners. Both Vice President Biden and former Mayor Pete have helped shape our economy. Joe Biden helped save the auto industry, which revitalized the economy of the Midwest, and led the passage and implementation of the recovery, saving our economy from a depression. Pete Buttigieg revitalized the sidewalks of downtown South Bend by laying out decorative brick. And both Biden and Buttigieg,
you get the gist of that. It goes on like that for some time. That's enough. But I want to play that in part because I think actually Joe Biden's power analysis of what design can do is quite astute. I don't think he intended it for it to be that way. But I think actually that like he's onto something that I think there's a mythologizing about what landscape architecture, urban design, city planning can do that he has rightfully deduced we actually aren't capable of it. I think the argument put forward in that essay is that power has structured the sort of potential of the design professions for the entire history of them pre and post professionalization, and that how we think about our work ought to change with the idea that power analysis and solidarity and work with the movements that are driving all of these things is at least as important as the sort of things we've valorized thus far in design culture, including like luxury real estate. And I'm not saying that we should, again, in that essay, that we should abolish, say, the luxury real estate development sector of landscape architecture, simply that we need a more pluralistic set of professions that have other on-ramps to other opportunities for people who don't see themselves in those firms. Having spent time in firms like that, I knew very early on those were not the right places for me. And having to sort of build this path through the political world and the policy world was much harder than it should have been, and is much harder still today than it should be for all of you should you decide to go that route. So with that, I want to talk, so that's the sort of theoretical, critical part of this that I think has shaped quite a bit of the work. And I want to talk now about what we've been doing around the Green New Deal. And I should begin, I guess, just by asking, has anybody in here read HR 109, the sort of non-binding resolution? I see Shelby shaking her head. I see a few other students. I feel like you're in her studio. You probably had to have. So one of the things I like to do to just sort of, I think, understand why we came to this point is to talk about the sort of content of HR 109. But before I do that, I get asked a lot, and actually Deborah asked me this earlier, like how did we get involved in this work? Because we're like writing pieces of congressional legislation, which is not a thing landscape architects tend to do. We're helping, I think, make the sort of policy and economic case for some of this stuff, which again is not a thing that a lot of designers get asked to do. And in part it's because I spent most of my professional career outside of design offices. I spent them working as an organizer. Actually, my first campaign job was in Waterloo, Iowa. So I haven't been back in 12 years, but that's the last time I was here on the 07-08 Obama campaign. And then went with him and others to the White House in 2011, 2012, or 2012, 2013. And got to know a lot of the people involved in the sort of early development of the Green New Deal as an idea. So this conversation, I think people became aware of really in 2018 with the sort of election or the primary win of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The work for this began in the spring of 2016, long before even the Democratic presidential nomination was over. And this is Varshini Prakash, Ragana Gunn-Wright, many of the other people who've been sort of steering the Green New Deal as an idea for a few years now, inviting me and a few others who got to know them either through that work or through other work we've done in DC to help them think through the political strategy, the content of what the Green New Deal might mean. And I think very early on in those conversations, it became clear to me that lots of people on their team who were thinking about, who are really smart on economic policy, science and technology policy, labor policy, who are great organizers, and they had no one really there who really thought or cared a whole lot about space in the built environment. And I think to their credit, like their response to that was like, absolutely, that's a problem, we don't know how to fix it, and we can't afford to figure it out after all these other ideas are set when it's like time to implement. So if you all want to like worry about that, if the Park Center worry about it, and if it works out, great, and if it doesn't, like there's no risk for us. And so to some extent, so that was effectively the origin story for us in 2016 of why we got asked to do some of this work. And so we had a very small role, I think, in reviewing HR 109 and have increasingly been asked now to do a bunch of ledge writing and analysis, effectively for all of the G&D legislation coming out of Congress, but also for all of the climate plans coming out of the different candidates in the field on the Democratic side. So with that in mind, we should talk about like the content of HR 109 and what's there for designers to care about. And I'll just go through these pretty quickly. One being, you know, if you pull out specific language, build resiliency against climate disasters, repair and upgrade all US infrastructure, achieve a zero emission energy standard, build an energy efficient and distributed smart grid, retrofit every single existing building in the country for max water and energy efficiency, realign all federal industrial policy around clean manufacturing, lower all agriculture-driven GHG emissions, overhaul the entire US transportation system, invest in public lands and other kinds of low-tech carbon sequestration, and remediate every hazmat and brownfield site in the US. So like, no big deal, we'll do this, take a couple years, we'll be done. I think the idea for this, one of the sort of brilliances of the G&D, long before we were ever invited to help shape it, was it as a vehicle for political strategy. And thinking about, for the first time in sort of the history of this country, of fusing the labor movement, the environmental movement, and others together under a single umbrella. It hasn't worked out perfectly, right? There are still lots of sort of union members who are very skeptical, and rightfully so, of a package like a Green New Deal. But there's a reason why SEIU and several other large unions in this country have signed on to it, because they understand that the only option forward for us, this is the only option on the table for us to think about climate change and clean energy at the moment. And if there are others, we will gladly sort of work them out in the way we've worked this one out. But at the moment, this is the only idea on the table for us. And so this is coming together, again, like part of the why. So that's a little bit of the what. Why this is coming together now is also a product just of what the climate scientists have been telling us for a very long time. I hate to say like the climate scientists as if they're a monolithic group of people who like all sit in a room like this together all the time. They're actually disagreeing a lot. And the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, puts out an annual or an assessment report every 4 to 6 years. They're getting ready to release their next one. And in the interim, they put out reports like this. So the three you see up here are the 1.5 degree report. So this is the report sort of telling us how close we are to getting to 1.5 degree warming based on our current carbon emissions. The other two are about land and oceans. These are reports that are coming out as these early Green New Deal conversations are happening and are absolutely shaping every bit of language you see in HR 109, every bit of language you see in HR 5185 that we worked on public housing, and thinking about the deadlines. And I think one of the criticisms that often gets leveled at the G&D, which is probably a fair one, is that it's like wildly unrealistic or wildly ambitious, which I think in some ways is true, but also I don't know if we take the science on this seriously, that there's any sort of pragmatic solution to this that isn't radical in the way that the Green New Deal is radical. And this is also happening as there's a sort of growing understanding that, in fact, like we have reached the limits of what we can do through personal behavior change, right? That like using not plastic straws is great. Driving less is great. Turning your lights off when you leave the room is great. And yet, 100 companies are responsible for more emissions than all of us could ever sort of drive down through that behavior on our own. Many of them are private, some of them are state-owned. This is from the Decolonial Atlas. You can pull it anytime you want. And that almost all of those emissions, too, right, are coming from the global north, much of that from the United States. Because the question, the sort of charge that also tends to get leveled at this is like, why should the US go first? But, people who, even on the right, who will admit that climate change is a problem, will tell you like it's a global problem, so like why is the US responsible for acting first? And the answer to that is because we're the most responsible for the state of the planet. Most of the carbon that's been emitted, since the Industrial Revolution has come from us, and even the most conservative sort of energy and climate engineers would tell you that the first domino to fall in a sort of global path to net zero is the US electric system. So getting the US electrical grid to net zero is the first thing that has to happen for any of these other things to be possible. And I think it's been important for us to think about this work, to take the sort of central reference of the Green New Deal quite seriously, the New Deal, which includes this weird poster of a dinosaur and syphilis. Don't understand who thought that was a good idea, but there we go. It's, I guess, like a brontosaurus, and maybe syphilis was around 65 million years ago. Who knows? But these are up here in part because the art projects of the New Deal are what people tend to remember most about it. And I think the other thing people tend to remember in addition to that is our sort of only real universal program in the US, which is Social Security, But it also did many other things. It built about 65,000 projects, like out there in the physical world, many of them still visitable, still used today. And I'm going to show you a few of them, but I think it's also important to remember, this is a weird GIF, that the New Deal is being made possible through this overlapping set of crises. One being their ecological crisis, the Dust Bowl, collapse of agriculture in the Midwest, and the forced migration of about 3.5 million people, many of them from the Midwest to the Central Valley of California. Their own economic crisis, which for them is the Great Depression, the global Great Depression, which gives us 20 to 25% unemployment in the US at the time. And then their own political crisis, which is the rise of global fascism. And I put this in here in part because we can think about, so there are many differences between the New Deal and the Green New Deal and that moment and this moment, but one of the sort of commonalities is that we find ourselves at a similar intersection of crises, our own ecological crisis being global and planetary climate change, our own economic crisis being, I think, the sort of failure of neoliberalism to deliver anything that it promised us. You can think about it as kind of the hangover from the Great Recession of the 2010s if you want, but it's been going on for quite a bit longer. And our own, again, sort of resurgent political crisis of global fascism, not only abroad, but also this time at home. And so this is an old screen grab. The site looks a little bit different now, but this is one of the best resources for pulling through this material that you can find, the Living New Deal, showing you the sort of physical footprint of the New Deal out there in almost every community around the country. And it would be almost impossible for you to set foot on any public or land-grant university without finding a building or an amphitheater built by a New Deal program. And in fact, I was just in Arkansas doing a version of this talk. The football stadium there, built by the PWA. They're terrible at football, but like people still go. I went when I was a student there. We can also look at one of the more, this isn't here because the TVA is one of the more sort of familiar agencies to designers for lots of reasons. There's been many books and other things written about the TVA. It's quite a dangerous example, and we'll talk about why. But for folks who don't know, right, this is part of a push during the New Deal to electrify the rural United States. And by the end of the New Deal, this, along with a few other programs, take us from 10 to 97% electrification in Tennessee Valley, in the rural South, the rural Midwest. And then also built these incredibly sublime sort of industrial landscapes that, sure, generated tons of hydroelectric power, but also they were the second largest public land tourist draw during the period of the New Deal. So they drew about 4.5 million people to visit these dams. This is the Norris Dam, named for Senator Norris, who helped push through the funding for the TVA in Tennessee. They were intended to be things other than just like unifunctional pieces of infrastructure. They were intended to be spectacles, meant to be enjoyed, meant to be sites of sort of labor organizing. So you're looking at unionized labor, which doesn't really exist in Tennessee anymore, at least not in any real capacity. But these are all union workers at the time coming in and out for a shift change. And it was also meant to communicate the sort of power of the state to do these things. And we can be worried and I think scared of that in a sense, right? Because this is like quite terrifying language to see, I don't know, like for the people of the United States sort of emblazoned on every facility the TVA has built for us. And when you walk into them, anybody here been to a TVA dam before? Got a couple. Yeah, so on the floor, right, you have key maps where you can see where you are within the system too. Some of which I think are excellent design communication tools, but which nevertheless sort of allied past some of the more complicated stories about the TVA. One being that the TVA, like every other aspect of the New Deal, was predicated on reproducing the best and worst sort of social relations of the time. So in the South, in the Jim Crow South, that meant that despite black residents constituting over 7% of the population around the Norris Dam, they made up just under 2% of the workers who qualified for TVA jobs. And electrification promised significant improvements in standard of living for some rural Americans, but Jim Crow, the pernicious inequities of Jim Crow were largely untouched. This is coming from Brent Siebel, the New Deal historian, and actually my neighbor in Philadelphia, who's finishing a new book actually about the sort of failure of liberalism and the New Deal over the course of the 20th century. And there are all kinds of reasons why the TVA, I think, is a problem for us to reference as designers for these reasons, which include it having segregated bathrooms, which include the other alphabet agencies, and we'll talk about having segregated work camps, and include the Resettlement Authority or Resettlement Administration, which built up a few new towns throughout the United States over the course of the New Deal, often refusing to pay its black workers and promising them the possibility of home ownership if they worked on projects, only to pull it back once they were done. But also, and all of those things in mind, The TVA also has now become the sort of primary sort of counter argument to this idea of public power. So for those of you who like spend all of their time, you know, like talking to Green New Deal nerds, which is all I do, you know that like the debate over whether to municipalize or hand over private utilities to the public sector and to public governance structures is very active. It's like the only thing that like 30 people I know spend all of their time doing. And the example that's often put forward for reasons why the public can't handle this kind of responsibility is the TVA. And it's because the TVA has one of the worst fuel mixes in the country. It's a public utility powered almost half by coal, to about 40–45%. And there are lots of reasons for that, right? Like the political economy of the Tennessee Valley is coal and the fossil fuel industry. And the board of the TVA is appointed by statewide elected officials, senators, and governors who cannot attain those offices without being friends to that industry, if not actually coming from them. So we shouldn't be surprised, right, that TVA's board is also then sort of beholden in many ways to coal and the fossil fuel industry. But nevertheless, it is really, the elevation of the TVA as an exemplar of what the New Deal can do has really undermined this argument for public power. It hasn't stopped it from sort of proceeding in interesting ways in New York, because it's actually quite an active conversation there, but it has not helped us in any real way. And just to give you a sense, right, pre-1976 or so, every piece of electrical infrastructure outside of the REA, which I'll talk about in a second here, was built and maintained and operated by the private sector. It wasn't until the 70s that we actually had a public regulatory framework for the energy industry in this country in terms of generation, transmission, and storage. And I say that because the REA is actually, I think, the much more interesting and useful example for us if we're interested in kind of usable paths for this moment, which I think we should be, which produce like these beautiful bits of propaganda. They're great, put lots of people to work building lots of things, but it also has an incredible footprint and impact. You're seeing the names here on the side are students from a studio of mine from last fall, but you're looking here at the sort of physical footprint of the REA. So over the course of the New Deal, the REA is initiated in 1933-34, initially in a very timid role, meant to be a broker between FDR's sort of administration and the private utility companies who at this point were not serving really any rural markets in the United States. And his plan was to have them negotiate with those private utilities to have them go out and build with you know, government-backed loans all of this infrastructure. And for the first year, he couldn't get an offer from them that was less than about 5 times what he thought it ought to cost, or his cabinet thought it ought to cost. So in the next year, he just gave the REA a lot more money, the equivalent of about $18 billion a year, so $180 billion over the course of the New Deal, to go out and build all of this infrastructure. And it gives us, you know, in 10 years or so, 380,000 miles of transmission line. It's about 40% of all the lines ever built in the history of the United States. Gives us about 800 rural electricity co-ops, including the one that I grew up on. I didn't know this until I started doing this work, but the Ozark Electric Co-op in Northwest Arkansas is an REA co-op. And for those of you who don't know the difference, right, like a rural electricity co-op, at least at the beginning, was a sort of publicly managed or at least cooperatively owned utility where the board would be comprised of locally appointed or elected people, often farmers, school teachers, nurses, whoever, as opposed to, say, like the CEO of Duke Energy. And many of these still exist today. And it took, along with the TVA and others, the rural United States from 10 to 97% electrification in just over 10 years. And we can also look at, you know, this is the precursor to the FAA, the CAA, the Civil Aeronautics Authority, or Civil Aeronautics Board. Those two kind of morph together because they change the names of the agencies like every 18 months during the New Deal. Which again gives us great propaganda, but also builds our entire municipal airport infrastructure in about 10 years. This is Midway in Chicago. This is the footprint of the CAA over the course of the New Deal, building, again, most of our municipal airport infrastructure, many of our military airports, and also because at the time this is pre-radar, it's building a bunch of these weird arrows on the ground that you would, as a pilot, like look out the window to see, to make sure you were going the right way, and then, like, I guess go back to flying. So that's what the lines are between these points. And then, you know, I'm not going to go into detail on a lot of these other maps, but just to give you a sense of, again, of the scale of impact, we're looking here at the PWA, the Public Works Administration and the Works Progress Administration, a really quick like gradient map of where, you know, they did the most work. So you can see not a lot in the Pacific Northwest, but a ton in New York and a bunch everywhere else. Looking at the Civilian Conservation Corps, these are the sites, not the camps they worked in, but the sites they actually built. So you get about 890 state parks over the course of the New Deal built by the CCC. That's like 90% of all the state parks ever created in the history of the United States. Many of them have problems, and we can talk about that if we want to in the Q&A too. But looking, again, this is the new Living New Deal site. I don't know when they made the update, but it's relatively recently. So just quickly, because we're here, we should just take a quick look at some of these in Iowa. So you can see there's a few here. We're in Ames. I think where, you can't see my arrow very well, but I think it's the sort of gold dot there is your post office. That's a New Deal project. If you go to the Iowa State Fairgrounds in Des Moines, that's a New Deal project. If you go to West High School Stadium in Waterloo, which I put in there because I lived in Waterloo. I don't think I probably went to this high school, but don't remember. It was a long time ago. Did I have that in there twice? Yeah, I did. So anyway, so I'd like to do this in part because I think there's a piece of this history that we've really forgotten. Just how transformative the New Deal was for everyday life, for everyday people. And part of the argument we made at the beginning of our sort of inserting ourselves in this Green New Deal conversation within the center has been that people are not going to understand the Green New Deal through like molecules and electrons, right? So like when I turn the lights on in here and it's powered by wind instead of coal, like who's gonna know? When there's less carbon in the atmosphere, like I can go read like the daily report from Hawaii or wherever and like, no, but like I'm not gonna walk around and be able to understand that. But I am gonna understand like massive interventions in the buildings, landscapes, public works, infrastructures of the place and transportation networks of the places that I live and move through every day. Whether that's, you know, someone being able to afford to buy all electrical appliances for my house to get rid of my conductor or to get rid of my gas stove, whether that's being able to commute to work on a low or no carbon BRT system or train or whatever it might be, whether that's getting a charging station for my electric vehicle that I was able to buy for like $10,000 less than it would have cost on the market because we have a subsidy program that supports that sort of thing. These are the things, these material differences in everyday life are what actually, one, are noticeable, and two, give us an opportunity to peel people away and give us a durable enough political coalition to actually achieve the laundry list of goals that are included within the Green New Deal. This is one of the things that FDR did particularly well, right, was to build a political coalition that lasted from 1934 until effectively 1980 with the election of Ronald Reagan, in part by making the material benefits of his programs evident and like undeniable to most people in the country. And I'll just sort of say again really quickly here, I think one of the things people often associate with the New Deal is that it was this sort of top-down sort of checklist that FDR and his sort of friends were sort of just running roughshod over people with. And effectively, it was just a transfer system, for better or worse, often for worse, but this is Brent again writing about it. The pragmatic political utility of local administrative autonomy and PPPs were an essential part of the New Deal. So basically, and the American federal structure simultaneously presented a tool and a barrier. It made possible the New Deal's most ambitious programs, enabled some of the most progressive parts of it to persist once the sort of national political winds had changed. But beneath that cheery language of partnership often lay a bitter truth. The prerogatives of localism and partnership built into the New Deal embedded new forms of racial and gender inequalities. And what he's doing in this work here, which you should all read if you're interested in this stuff, and it's sort of at the bottom of the slide if you can see it, is sort of arguing that the New Deal itself was a way of sort of reproducing power structures that already existed. The money that flowed from these different alphabet agencies was not purposely done to sort of create new leaders and new centers of power in communities. It was given to like the places that were ready to receive it on day one, which were chambers of commerce, the sort of first planning commissions as they were just kind of getting started in a few city councils. And effectively, the sort of like white growth machine that has driven most of our urban politics and growth for the last century. And as we think about what a Green New Deal might also do to sort of restructure power, this is a very important lesson for us to think about that's outside, let's say, of the sort of conventional design purview, but that is nevertheless going to determine whether or not what we do is successful. And I have this in here a little bit too, really quickly before I get on to like the last bit for the center. We're thinking about this in part because one of the things that happened in 2009, 2010 with the stimulus bill is that we got the better part of $1 trillion as a country to invest in infrastructure, and almost all of it went towards things that no one actually wanted. They were projects that had been sitting there for 10, 15, 20 years and were shovel ready, and that's why they were funded. For good reason in some sense, like you do want the money, I think, to flow very quickly and to put people to work. But it also meant that we built a lot of things no one wanted or was excited about. And that not only does that mean we wasted a lot of it, but it also means we missed an opportunity to sort of pull more people into a longer sort of conversation or a longer program of infrastructure and placemaking that could have defined, say, the Obama presidency, instead of what I think is actually quite an astute book here from Reed Hunt called A Crisis Wasted, which is talking about the missed opportunity of that stimulus bill to really do anything of any long-lasting or material benefit. Really quickly, I'm going to talk about what Plan A was for the Green New Deal, which was not doing all of this stuff. I would have never been involved in it if it had worked. So you all probably remember this. This is the sit-in in late 2018 before this Congress is sworn in, before Speaker Pelosi is back in the Speaker's office. The Sunrise Movement, that's AOC obviously. Let me see if we can see Rashini in this anywhere. If not, this is their attempt. What they're asking for at this moment is a select committee in the House. Let me turn this down a little bit. They're asking for a select committee in the House with subpoena power that can compel expert testimony, so engineers, scientists, frontline communities, whoever it might be, to help them write what would become the package of legislation that amounts to a Green New Deal in full public view, so that you and I can know exactly what's happening anytime we want to turn on C-SPAN or whatever and sort of watch some of this testimony take place. And as you probably know, we did not get that. Let me skip this over. We did not get that. What instead we got was this ad hoc process. So we didn't get a select committee. So this work is now being done sort of quietly in an ad hoc way as opportunities arise, which I think has been in some ways to our benefit, but I think has been to everyone's detriment that this hasn't been a bigger, more public, more inclusive process. And we've thought about that work in a couple ways. So I think putting that essay out in places was probably not like the smartest career move to make for me, but I felt was an important thing to do, and gave us some space, I think, to begin putting this event together. Did anybody come to or watch this event? Doug, you were there, right? Yeah. Anybody else? I see a couple. Yeah, you watched it. Cool. So it's still up. You can watch it. This is from an event in September called Designing a Green New Deal. This was our way of sort of looking at that sort of list of things that we said are relevant to sort of the design professions within HR 109, and sort of saying, okay, like some people have looked at this and said it's missing X, Y, or Z. That's really, really important to me and my like 6 friends in my subfield, so we don't want to engage with it. But we looked at it and said, okay, there's like a lot that's missing here that we'd like to add. There's a lot that we're not quite sure makes any sense, so we want to challenge it. And this was our attempt to pull as many people, both within and outside of design, together to have a conversation about that as we could. And you're looking here, this is the second panel for the day. At the podium is my state rep, Elizabeth Fiedler. Next to her, Karine Talo, who is the organizing director at WEACT, one of the largest, oldest environmental justice organizations in the United States. David Roberts from Vox, Rihanna Gunn-Wright, Leah Stokes, and then Allison Lassiter and Ellen Nisis, who run our faculty. And this was part of a sort of day-long program where you can see Varshini here, sort of at the end of the day when everyone's like ready to go to sleep, instead making all of them stand up and sing and do all of this other stuff. I don't know if you know the people in this photo very well, but it's like quite hilarious. This is, I don't know what I would call this. You're seeing like the DSA Eco-Socialist Caucus, like on the far left, next to like our former dean and very big fan of many of the corporate architecture firms that I just talked about at the beginning, Marilyn Taylor, like all in the same room, singing the same song, cheering, being very excited. It was a surreal moment for us. And this is Jim Goodman, who's the head of the Small Family Farmers Association, who's been our sort of agricultural and land policy collaborator on a lot of this work. But this event itself was an intervention in lots of ways for us. So internally within the university, this was not an event we had permission to do. So we were talking about this at lunch. I had some resources available to me in the center, not a ton, but enough to sort of get the ball rolling on this. And so we began inviting all of these people. We began reserving space. We began publicizing it before we had asked anyone administratively if we could do it. And partially because we knew the answer to that question would probably be no if we were to ask first. And so this event itself was kind of a structure test for us to see what the University of Pennsylvania was willing to sort of let us get away with. There are some things we can talk about not when I'm not being recorded that they didn't let us get away with, but for the most part the event was allowed to go on. And it was also, I think, a sort of intervention within landscape architecture specifically, but design professions more generally, because this is happening a few months after a very public fight that I had with Sean Kelly, the former president of the National American Society of Landscape Architects, who he and I were together in New Jersey for their state ASLA conference, I guess a little over a year ago now, where I gave a very benign talk about Design with Nature Now and like the exhibition, and in the last 90 seconds put up a screen cap of AIA endorsing HR 109 and asking people in the audience like why hasn't ASLA done anything like this. And here's the sort of email and phone number listed on the ASLA website. You should all take your break, spend your break sort of calling and emailing. Sean, I did not know this at the time, was in the audience. Was not happy about that, and went on stage the next day, and instead of giving his talk, used the time to sort of trash the Green New Deal. He didn't know the name of it, he called it that Green Plan, but he used it for that purpose, and set off like a kind of Cold War between us for a little while until eventually Sean's presidency ended, so he's gone. Solves that problem. The executive director, who was there at the time, is also now gone and was part of the problem, so that has mostly been solved. And ASLA has actually become, if you saw, they were one of the first organizations to endorse the public housing bill. Not an obvious thing for a landscape architecture, advocacy or organization to do, in part because I think they have been sort of folded into this conversation through this event and through other things other folks have been doing in ways that happen much faster than we expected. So on this sort of cycle of political policy work, I'm not going to get into the details of this, although you are welcome to like go peruse this in your free time when you want to read dense policy reports at night, because that's what people do, I guess. The first bit of it is coming through Data for Progress. This is Dana LaDonna Cohen, who is my collaborator on almost everything at Penn. He's a sociologist, a climate sociologist. He and I led this project, a Green New Deal for Public Housing Communities, on behalf of Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Sanders and later others, thinking about public housing as a sort of strategic lever in the march to decarbonization, jobs, and justice that are at the core of the Green New Deal, for lots of reasons. One being public housing is the most stigmatized piece of infrastructure in the United States, maybe in the world, and that it also has about $110 billion maintenance deficit right now. So if you've spent any time in it, I grew up in public housing in Arkansas, you know that it's full of asbestos and lead. Many of the roofs are falling in, there's no HVAC system, there are all kinds of problems with it. And so through, not a whole lot of analysis, you're able to find out that, if you owe 110 billion to those residents in the form of deferred maintenance, and you add 50 or 60 billion to that, you can do all the maintenance and take them as close to net zero as is technologically feasible at the moment. So why not just do that? And luckily for us, People's Action, which is a sort of a network of tenants' rights and housing organizers all over the country, have organized something called the Homes Guarantee. We're a part of putting this conversation, this topic on the table for AOC in her primary campaign, and so she made it one of her first priorities when she got into office, and it allowed us to do all this kind of work. I'm not going to get, again, into the weeds on this, but there's this suite of policy reports, there's this interactive map, which I'll talk about in just a second, but just also to give you a sense for those of you thinking about graduate school who are not already in graduate school. I had a couple of exemplary students on this with me, Zan Lillahai, Katie Lample. We're doing versions of this for transportation now that those two are also helping us on. That'll all be public in a couple weeks. And we can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. But this has been a really incredible experience for us to get to work with this network of people through Data for Progress on behalf of these members. And this, again, you would think that a map like this exists somewhere, of just public housing on top of some socioeconomic factors and some flood risk. It doesn't, in part because public housing data is not universally available. So it is all theoretically publicly available. It just requires you knowing the exact right person to ask and the exact right data set and the sort of code for it. So we had to use congressional staff to work with HUD, the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and a few others to find all of this data and put it into one place. I think to our great surprise, it did not exist anywhere, so we took it upon ourselves to make it. And as I said, this is happening now for transportation. There's a sort of running list that the Sunrise Movement has put together for us and for others of sort of their order of priority for how this stuff is supposed to roll out. Agriculture was supposed to be second. They could not find a sort of willing member in Congress yet to sort of take the lead on that. I think those conversations are still pretty fluid, but transportation then became the next one in line. After that, as far as I know, we'll sort of move on to civic infrastructure, which is schools, libraries, parks, and then public land, I think, is probably next in line. And I think how much of that we're directly involved in will be determined by, I think, how quickly all of this goes. We could find ourselves in a very different world in a few months with, depending on who the nominee is, depending on how the November election goes, about what the urgency of this work. But at the moment, this is what we're sort of crashing on because it feels incredibly urgent. And outside of those political sort of cycles of work, we've been doing this other bit that's off cycle but related. Has anybody seen this project yet? An Atlas for the Green New Deal that we put out? A couple people. So if you go to our site, you can find it. It's 100+ images. Took us the better part of 2.5 years to assemble with a team of, over the course of those 2.5 years, maybe 10 people. Going in, trying to assemble all of the spatialized climate and climate-related data that we could in one place, much of it paywalled, much of it sort of behind either peer-reviewed journals or just never made publicly available by the researchers who are producing these things, and assembling it, curating it into something we hope or think is beautiful enough for people to want to look at. 100 maps is a lot to look at, and making it freely available to anyone with access to the internet. So this is all there. There's 3,000 or so words of sort of framing text that accompanies it, but it includes a kind of inventory of things like parks, forests, and wetlands, not especially new for you. It includes the sort of energy infrastructure landscape of the country, probably not especially new to you. It includes dominant crop types, probably also not especially new to you. And meat production, same thing. It also, I think, tries to make this argument that, again, reaching back to the New Deal is our central reference, that this idea that government is ineffective, cannot do any of the things that the Green New Deal is demanding that it do, or that it does, is a product of designing like a public sector that cannot take those things on. If we have a more expansive view, I think, of sort of public history or public government history in this country, we know that in fact, like the state has, and in some sort of quiet ways remains quite powerful. I was blown away last night to hear the former vice president talk about DARPA, which I don't know if other people heard that or know much about DARPA. DARPA is basically like every component of this phone here was developed by DARPA. It is our quiet sort of version of industrial policy in the United States. The Obama administration created its sort of clean energy equivalent called ARPA-E, which is the sort of clean energy research version of DARPA. DARPA is military technology. ARPA-E is like advanced photovoltaics and biofuels that aren't corn, they're like algae and other things. But that we've done, the whole point of, I think, this exercise is that we've done some of these big things before, and in fact, some of them are underway. These are not completed, but sort of aspirational large landscape conservation projects underway. And we sort of put that against the backdrop of what the stakes of climate change are, just like in where and how we live. So you're looking at a sort of animation here of city of Chicago, state of Illinois, over the rest of the century. Those of you probably know, Chicago is already the highest heat mortality death rate city in the country. So more people die there from heat every year per capita than any other city in the country. And by the end of the century, its temperature profile will look like that of Dallas, Texas. A problem in all kinds of ways. One of those is a built environment challenge that we have to begin thinking about. And working with Matt Hauer, a geographer at Florida State, he's the first person to really go in and count up how many structures and how many people live in them will be underwater under a few different sea level rise scenarios. And then to merge that with his own demographic modeling, which is based on sort of historical and cultural migration patterns within the United States. And again, we're looking here at sort of out migration, so where people are leaving and going to, as well as in migration, where people are sort of moving to as the sort of big hubs as a result of many things, including climate change, which again presents huge built environment challenges for us, both in how we anticipate those people moving to new places from a physical infrastructural perspective, and what we do with all the places that they're leaving. I don't know a ton about sort of Ames economy, but where I grew up in Arkansas, in a post-industrial city, you will have to look very hard to sort of understand what will happen to many of these places without sort of anticipatory structures and frameworks in place for what happens to communities that are losing 10, 20, 30, 40% of their population and economy over time. It's not a coincidence that they're the sort of epicenter of all of our sort of diseases of despair in this country. And layered on with that is this, the median projection from the census that we're going to add 100 million people to the US by 2060, which, if we think about that on the scale of New York, that's like 13 New Yorks. At the scale of Chicago, it's like 34 Chicagos. At the scale of Phoenix, which is probably the likeliest outcome, it's like 63 Phoenixes. So again, how we think about the Green New Deal is like an instrument for doing all of these sort of unalterable built environment interventions better, both in ways that align with the sort of goals of the Green New Deal, the jobs, justice, and carbon goals, but that also give us an opportunity to sort of peel people away that we might not have peeled away otherwise into our coalition. And I'm gonna sort of start to wrap up here just by showing you a few things our students did in the studio in the fall for us. in a studio dedicated to the Green New Deal. We didn't start with a site, and we didn't really end with one. What we did was ask them to answer 2 questions. This was a sort of advanced options studio. One was, what are the places that you have to get right to achieve the goals of the Green New Deal? So if we think those 3 big planks, job justice and decarbonization, are important enough to organize industrial policy and the sort of levers of federal government around, where should we do that first? What are the places that you absolutely have to get right to achieve those goals? And then the second was, what are the places that are not obviously already in the coalition to support something like this? So I don't know, Brooklyn's probably gonna be, figure this out or not. They're probably gonna figure out, New York State is already doing incredible climate policy work, same for California. So what are the parts of the country where making the material benefits of the Green New Deal clear immediately and first for people who live there, who've been ignored and underinvested and in many cases purposely depopulated for a very long time in this country, how can that be a sort of instrument for accelerating or expanding the scope of what's possible through a Green New Deal? And rather than do a sort of conventional final review, which I have all kinds of problems with, which we can talk about if you want, we had our students produce a pop-up exhibition and give gallery tours and then give panel talks about the work. And we gave them a lot of leeway to produce all kinds of weird things. So one of our students produced these graphic novels, essentially, of different characters, essentially. This is looking at the Midwest, of sort of pre and post intervention, which we can come back to if you want to look at them. We're just looking at sort of pre and post Green New Deal, sort of first wave of investment, what life was like for 3 different kinds of communities there through these different people's stories. And others produced probably more conventional sort of drawings or familiar drawings to you. This is looking at land reclamation strategies in Appalachia, which include everything from pumped hydro storage as a low-tech battery for parts of Appalachia to sort of re and afforestation as a carbon sequestration and jobs guarantee sort of program. And you can see they produce some pretty conventional renderings again, at a pumped hydro station where I guess people are allowed to swim. I always thought you would get sucked down when the water gets drained out, but maybe there's a siren that goes off. And also showing you sort of generally how all of these different components of a Green New Deal get sort of arrayed along through the landscape. And then lastly, the thing we asked them to do was to think about how you communicate all of these things very simply to people in ways the New Deal did quite well, even though they had a poster with a dinosaur and syphilis together. And so they created these bits of propaganda that were part of the exhibition, which again, we can talk more about if you want. I want to pause on this one because it's just the weirdest one. We had a student who imagined a sort of equivalent of Burning Man for the Mississippi River, but it's Drowning Man. So I guess you just take a lot of shrooms and then go swim around in the Mississippi River. A big part of their plan was effectively to use agriculture in the Midwest and climate adaptation work in the Mississippi Delta, the lower sort of Louisiana, Mississippi area, as a sort of way to connect ecotourism and other bits of interventions along and through the Mississippi River. One of the sort of catalysts being this Drowning Man event, which they have a bunch of fake band names here, like the Coy Boys, Nail Polish. Our students get delirious sometimes, and they do things like that. And then I'll sort of end here, right, by showing you, again, the stakes of what this atlas. We used this atlas as a platform to begin the studio. So before it was public, it was used by our studio to sort of think about this stuff. This is a median emissions projection scenario for the U.S. So looking at total economic effects. Thinking in particular about agriculture. These are secondary, so we're using other people's numbers here. Those of you who've read David Walswell's book, The Uninhabitable Earth, this is the study that underpins his very trembling, worried opening graph about how things are much worse than they seem. I'm trying to remember exactly how that goes, but I think he says something like, "It is, I promise, worse than you think." And I think the argument we tried to put forward, and in fact emblazoned in bold letters at that exhibition, were that things in fact are much better than you think, or at least they can be through some large national program like a Green New Deal. And so with there, I know I'm probably over, but I just want to thank you all for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, so if you want to come up and speak.
Doug, are you doing this with us? Are you doing this with us?
Yeah.
Okay. Share this.
We have, well, firstly, I just want to say thanks so much for a fantastic lecture. I'm not going to say too much. I think everyone else should have an opportunity to say something and ask you some questions. And I think if we could start in the chain that we're in with the microphone, Shelby. You want to start with the students? Start with the students? Okay. So if you could introduce yourself to Mark.
Hi, my name is Samar, and I am representing Data, which is the Student Journal of Architecture here at Iowa State. Data does a lot of things. One of the things we do is produce a journal at the end of the academic year, and we have a theme every year. And so last year our theme was End, which had to do with, there are generally 1 year we've had we had projections, we had sexy, which was about gender politics, but last year we had something that was called End, and it had to do a lot with how we interpret End, or even look beyond the end, or talk about the whole debate about post-Anthropocene and things like that. But this year our topic is care, to really talk about things we care about and how do we even start to care about some of the things in the first place. And so we're really excited we have brainstormed the questions together as a group. We read your essay on design and the Green New Deal, and there's some interesting questions that we want to share, but I'll let you introduce.
My name is Ruchi. I'm here from NOMAS, which is the National Organization of Minority Architecture Students at Iowa State. We try to be active in the community and try to be active in the overall NOMAS organization by going to the conference and really trying to stay active with understanding how architecture and minority really can how we can empower ourselves in the field of design.
So I think one of the questions that came around while we were having conversations about the reading, and eventually there were a lot of conversations about unionizing. One thing that kind of stood out was, which also something you mentioned about that Green New Deal is this opportunity for architects and designers to sort of participate. And I think that's a good point to maybe even consider if at all you find the Green New Deal insufficient in any way, and if so, how? And what is the best way to communicate it in order for us to engage more effectively to that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are all kinds of ways that I think about the Green New Deal as being kind of insufficient at the moment, or at least there are things about it that I worry a lot about, right? So the two big ones I think are that the Green New Deal, HR 109, and every other like public document that you can look at has nothing to say really about kind of international affairs and foreign policy, right? And yet all of the technology that's like sort of either explicitly or implicitly called out in HR 109, PVs, electric cars, turbines, all of these other things that are supposed to like electrify and power everything in our lives through clean energy, require rare earth minerals and require all kinds of other things we have to extract from places we have a very long history of treating like shit when we extract things from them. And that every time I ask this question internally, I'm told like, oh, someone else is like working on that. And so I'm like really nervous that the Green New Deal becomes a weapon for like green imperialism, like everything else that we've done for a long time in this country. I also worry that it's like very eco-modernist in its orientation, right? That like technology is going to solve much of this for us. And I just think like in many ways that's hopelessly naive. Like technology is not going to solve a lot of this for us. And in fact, technology probably can and will make much of this worse. And this is where you start to see people, I think, sort of leaning into discussions or ideas around geoengineering as like a potential solution, right? That like we could just basically turn down the sun. I mean, it's a little more complicated than that, but like that's effectively what geoengineering is doing, ignoring like the fact that we don't know any of the other like unanticipated consequences of that in our lives. We also do know some of the consequences of it are things like the ocean continuing to acidify and heat at like rates we've never been able to measure before. And like what happened, I mean, we're probably going to get to a world, if not in our lifetimes, then like not long after them, in which there are no like sustained fisheries left globally. And geoengineering is not going to help that, it's going to make it worse. And And so anyway, so I think like those are the things that worry me the most, the like tilt towards eco-modernism, the tilt towards kind of green imperialism. And then I also just worry in general that like there are a lot of smart people on the right who recognize that climate change is something they cannot ignore forever. And so they're already imagining what like an eco-fascist program, an alternative would look like to this. Jair Bolsonaro, who Björk Engels is like hanging out with, is modeling this in Brazil. Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio, Josh Hawley are like floating these ideas in the United States. And that's a program of ideas that looks basically like building a bunch of walls, keeping people out, and taking care of ourselves, which is an idea I think that we probably all know would be popular in many parts of this country, and is quite dangerous. And I worry again that like the Green New Deal, in part because the perception of it has been shaped so much by sort of right-wing propaganda machine, which has a 50-year history of being developed that the left doesn't have, has been shaped to like be this idea about like no more planes, no more cows, instead of like framing it as a sort of vehicle for achieving a sort of degree of public luxury and egalitarianism that much of the rest of the like Western or global North world enjoys, that the US for lots of reasons does not. And so so this is the sort of third, I think, worry, is that we just get outflanked by the right on this kind of stuff.
So you mentioned something during your presentation about the New Deal, and it basically setting up new power structures that, in the end, still implemented some racial and gender inequalities. The question I have with this and related to the Green New Deal and design is that many minority communities are often overlooked and greatly neglected by government policies, and often they don't get funding necessary for the climate change resilience plans. So how can we as designers, being, as you say, instruments of power, and coming from privileges and an inflated sense of saviorism, allow resilience design to be implemented in these communities without simply implementing large overscale designs that create issues of gentrification?
Yeah. These are great. These are like more serious questions than I get from some of my faculty colleagues. I love them, but you know. So if you look at the picture behind us, right, this is the press conference announcing HR 109. And ASC says many things at this thing. One of them is that people should view HR 109 as like an RFP, right? That is a request for proposals. It's a framework, and people should think creatively about implementation and adding depth and layers and other things to the package of ideas that are in it that, for whatever reason, they overlooked because it was put out pretty quickly. This is February 2019, 2 months after she's sworn into office. And if you know anything about the like composition of a house or a house office in Congress, you have like 6 permanent staffers and a couple interns, and like everybody's doing too many things. And so they did it pretty quickly, and they left things out, some necessarily probably, and some probably accidentally. And so I think, you know, they viewed it as a chance for people to begin offering ideas like this for them. And I think one of the things the New Deal teaches us is that if we don't anticipate this question about like how and where, you know, capital and power are directed, then the people best positioned to continue to already have it, best positioned to accumulate it even more, and to express their will like in the landscape. It is why, you know, I think we had Naomi Klein at that event I mentioned in September, who has a new book out on the Green New Deal, which is fine, I think, but I still think her most important work on this topic is coming from the shock doctrine and thinking about, you know, the ability of elites and people with power and capital to continue to accumulate and express their will kind of out in the physical landscape. And so one of the things I think the Green New Deal, to come all the way around to answering your question, one of the things I think it sort of demands of us is to think about those local power structures and how the projects that we try to assemble, because not every design firm is just, I mean, if you're a giant firm like an AECOM, like an HOK, you're often just like either constantly chasing RFPs or projects are being brought to you by partners you've worked with forever. But for some of the smaller and medium-sized offices, you're often like quite entrepreneurial in trying to assemble projects, like going after weird pots of money, some of which might be grants and coming from other kind of like non-profit sources, and some of which might involve working with organizations that are not part of the like formal power structure of a city. And so I think thinking creatively about how you assemble those teams is one of the most important things we can do, because I think left to its own devices, the sort of huge infusion of capital that a Green New Deal would bring would simply reproduce the kind of inequality that we already have. And so again, I think like thinking through what kind of power structure we want will tell us which of those groups, which of those communities, which of those people have to be a part of that project team going forward. And I think for us anyway, like in the center too, and here at a university, like we have an opportunity to operate outside of market forces. Like University of Pennsylvania has an endowment of like $14.5 billion. Like it does not need to compete with firms working in New York or San Francisco or Chicago, or like develop a bunch of weird like speculative proposals for those cities. It has an obligation, and one of the ways I view my job is we have an obligation to use the sort of prestige and resources available to us in ways that subvert those power structures that have allowed universities like Penn to accumulate that kind of money. And Iowa State doesn't have that kind of money, but it has enough, and it has enough power and prestige to do some of these things here too.
All right, well, first, thank you for a wonderful presentation, and Martha and Richie, thank you for starting us off with really good questions. So my question, I suppose, has to do with representation and getting the public to buy into a plan like the Green New Deal. I'm going to try and kind of tie in a couple things that I'm thinking about. First, you kind of opened with saying this is a planetary problem that we all have to take a larger share of responsibility for, because the U.S. is disproportionately more responsible. So that's kind of like one thing that I'm thinking about, and the other is this kind of leaked proposal for federal buildings, kind of that I think we've all heard of by now. So we know through that leaked proposal and through all these governments around the world that fascist regimes frequently use nostalgia as a way of representing their schemes. And unfortunately, whenever I look up the Green New Deal, I see these representations of it which are really nostalgic. And I think you're starting to get at it with some of your student work as kind of what alternatives to that might be. Mm-hmm. But I was wondering, what do you think the role, both of like the actual design details in architecture and the way we're presenting these things and like these propaganda posters, stories that people like, illustrations that people like Molly Crabapple have put together. Yeah. But what is the kind of design aesthetic that is anti-nostalgia or anti-kind of fascist, I suppose? Yeah. If you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, this is, again, like a hugely important question, and I think maybe the space where design has the most to offer is thinking through these representational questions. It's easy for the right? I mean, I think, the idea that we can just like put a column on everything and things will be like great again it's not hard to understand why that's popular. And again, like I'm just thinking through my experiences like in Fayetteville at the University of Arkansas, and like every Greek life house having a column on it, and every one of those people leaving and then building a house with a column on it, where they then live. Neoclassical architecture is popular for lots of reasons. It's not a surprise it's been popular with like fascist regimes all over the world. But I think what the right has done, and Corey Rogan, who's a political theorist formerly at NYU, I think he's at Stony Brook now, has written a lot about this. He has a book called The Reactionary Mind, which is sort of tracing the sort of history of conservative thought from the French Revolution to Donald Trump, essentially. And he's making the argument that, at least in the American experience, that the right has engaged in a sort of level of ideation and world building that the left has never really seriously tried. And that one of the many things that has bought them is just a sort of unstopped sort of string of successes for the last at least half century, again, since really at least Reagan, in which they have imagined the world they want and mostly achieved it. and I think the New Deal aesthetic is a problem for all kinds of reasons, right? One being that, like, in many ways it was a colonialist project, in many ways it was a sort of reification of the sort of racial project of America, like the white supremacist project of America. And I don't know what, again, I don't know what the right sort of aesthetic or visual language is for us, but I do know we need to invent it. And I do know we need to engage seriously in world building in a way that like hasn't been done seriously by the left in a really long time. I spend a lot of time like in architecture reviews where the work is incredible, but it's also like frivolous. Like it's beautiful, sort of spectacular drawings, and like completely disconnected from political economy. And I think until we can start to think about tethering those two things together in really radical and subversive ways, we're not going to get there. And you know, our students had, I think, the better part of like 7 weeks to produce all of that visual material because we spent most of that studio reading and talking and doing other things, which was a weird thing to do in a studio. But I think, you know, our hope, I think, in putting that event together, in doing the studio work and doing some of these other things is that as many people as possible would be working on this, which is what, I mean, it's been like one of the most, I think, exciting parts about running around to do talks like this is to meet people who are doing this all over the country. Because the Green New Deal in general and this question of like visual language in particular are way too big for like any one person, group of people, university, whatever to own. Like this is a, in my mind, like an ideological and generational project that we're just beginning.
This might be a sort of second part to Eliza's question because I think you already started answering it a bit, but you spoke a bit about your path from design practice and into policy. How do designers at the beginning of their careers, maybe some of the people in the room right now, or even later in their careers, avoid the nihilism of arriving at the conclusion that architecture cannot be extricated from the production of capital and the systems of capitalism? So where's the hope in all of this?
It's okay. We'll just pass it for a long time. I mean, there are a couple ways. I think one is that, you know, the culture of design education and the design professions in general is just like unnecessarily oppressive, right? So much of your design education is about overworking you and conditioning you for a lifetime of exploited labor. So that when you go out into a firm, you will like not question having to work 80 hours a week for shit pay and no benefits. And so part of that is on us, I think, to sort of think about about breaking some of these horrible sort of hazing patterns that were imposed on us by faculty who were our faculty as students. And is part of why, I mean, again, in the studio, we did not always succeed at doing that, but we did, I think differently about the sort of pedagogical approach to reviews, knowing that our students weren't getting a lot out of them. And there are many things we would change, I think, about the sort of structure of the gallery talks and the panels at the end, in which we had a really wonderful audience there of designers and not designers. So they get, we had Kate Orff, Lisa Switkin, and then a couple of our faculty, along with Julian Brave-Noiscat and Mary Hagler, and a few others who are, in the sort of Green New Deal climate world, but are not designers. I think helping us locate some of this work outside the professions in ways that we have to do more of. And I think that gets to like maybe the second point of this, which is that if we find ways to make design education and practice less oppressive in our daily lives, it opens up opportunities to like build and find community outside the design professions, which is the thing I did as an undergrad that has served me like better than anything else I've ever done in my life. It's how I met most of the people who eventually were like my on-ramp into the political and policy world, because I just got out of my architecture school enough. I don't think I was supposed to. I like got hammered for that grade-wise, but it worked out okay. And the other is that, I think, we have to, I think there's like sort of an ideal, and we can wait for ASLA and AIA and APA to sort of do this or not, but there is sort of like an idealized form of practice that we lift up. And it tends to be this like development of luxury real estate and of like things that even I think the most like ardent supporters of will openly, in private anyway, will sort of openly acknowledge that is a sort of fraught, at best fraught and at worst like deleterious kind of practice, that like building luxury real estate can keep the lights on and employ a lot of designers and maybe create some public space that wouldn't have been created otherwise, but it is also nevertheless, like, on balance, a disastrous thing to like impose on the built environment. And I think like we can find other ways of doing work that are outside of those kinds of practices. And I don't know if you've had Peggy Deemer here to do a talk before. Love Peggy, she's amazing. I know Doug is in the lobby with her. I don't know if any of you are as well, but you know, she had a great piece to the Avery Review, I guess last year or the year before, about like the idea of deprofessionalization, which I'm sure would not be popular like in ASLA, AIA, but which is a discussion worth having for all kinds of reasons. One is that it makes these alternatives to like conventional firm life more like real and valuable and valued, I think, for all of us. And the other is that it recognizes that there are many people practicing architecture, landscape architecture, city planning, urban design without degrees all over the world, many of them better than us, and who we could learn a lot from, and from whom we could maybe also make ourselves useful, if not for these kinds of structures. So I don't think there are like any easy answers, and I think the thing that I think about the most with my students anyway is trying to find, for the ones who I think are looking for alternatives to that, you know, kind of firm life. And I don't think like the alternative to firm life is right for everyone, and I don't think we should try to find ways to do away with it. Although, you know, if I were taking off my like designer hat for a second, I'd be like, yeah, we should abolish capitalism, and then there wouldn't be a need for this kind of design. But I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. So in the meantime, we can think about like other alternatives that I think give us a sort of heterodox and not homogeneous kind of practice of design out in the world that isn't incumbent upon landing at Field Ops or SCAPE or AECOM or wherever. Doug, do you want to ask a question?
No. Well, I do, but I can ask you
okay,
later.
yeah.
So hold on to the mic for
Okay.
a moment for me. I'm really, really conscious of the time. I think I'm going to have 2 questions. So who's going to put their hand up? Oh, we have no questions.
There's one in the
We
back
can have
there.
dinner
There's
questions.
one in the back.
Do you want to shout it?
Yeah, shout, Ronnie. We can do it.
Talk about conversations and ways to approach such a holistic problem. Have you thought of looking at system thinking and approaching those issues? In the sense of like having an interdisciplinary approach, I guess which you are already doing, but how would that like help students to approach it?
Yeah, so the question's about like systems thinking, systems theory, and all of this. And I think for me, like, it's kind of impossible to do any of this work without that orientation, right? So I think thinking about political economy requires systems thinking, which isn't a thing. I mean, so it's always I don't want to like monolithicize like design, because architecture is a much larger field with a much more diverse set, I think, of like theory and criticism and practice than landscape architecture, which is quite small and which is quite homogeneous as like a collection of theory and practice. Not totally, but much more so than architecture. But nevertheless, like, you're getting, I would assume, looking at the work in Doug's class today, looking at the work from the exhibition this afternoon, that you're getting a fair amount of that kind of theory and thinking already in your curriculum. And it maybe feels like it's just something everyone knows because you're surrounded by people who all know it. But this is not, it's not a mode of thinking or analysis that's common in, say, like the policy world, where everyone has been trained in this like neoliberalization of the bureaucracy to imagine that like the optimal fix to any problem is like the smallest market-based intervention possible, right? So we have a bunch of like people who think of themselves as very serious like housing people who are furious that Daniel and I were involved in the public housing work, because like their like biggest idea is like, I don't know, we need like a 2% increase in like LIHTC credits to build a few more units of affordable housing. And so like, one, they've like never achieved that because it's like such a small goal, no one would ever like get organized in favor of it. And 2, even if they did like realize it, it wouldn't matter because it's like no new housing really. And so I think like you should give yourself more credit in knowing that you already have like a set of tools in thinking. Like setting aside the visualization, setting aside the design operations, setting aside all the like construction documentation expertise you're going to have, just that like way of thinking through like the interrelation of systems isn't unique necessarily to design, but it is almost totally absent from the policy world, and it is a thing that people there are very, very hungry for. So I don't, yeah, I mean, I think it's embedded in a lot of this work, and in the center we have students from across the university. We actually have a physics PhD and a communications PhD working alongside city planners and architects and landscape architects and other people. So it's a sort of core part of our work, but again, I think it's a thing you should carry with you wherever you go after this. I don't know if other people want to jump in.
I think just for the sake of time, we're going to continue
Okay.
conversations over pizza and wine.
Great.
So, thanks very much for your questions, and thank you very, very much, Billy Fleming. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.